Hi and welcome to this video which will describe the fundamentals of luminosity masks and exposure blending. This is just a theoretical video, there are no raw files or images to follow along with. So to begin, luminosity masks are, as the name suggests, masks built around luminosity. So when we press something like a bright swan in Lumi32, that will essentially convert this image in front of us into a grayscale. So I press bright swan, and there is the black and white version of our image. So this mask is targeting the highlights, you see, because the highlights are brighter in this mask. That means those are the objects that are selected. And the things that are light grey, 50% grey or a little bit darker grey are partially selected. The brighter the tone, the more selected they are. So for example, if I press curves layer now in Lumi32 and open a curves layer, I can increase the contrast of that layer, and you see we're only affecting the tones that were selected in the mask. Now, to view a mask, we hold down Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac and left click on our mask down here on the layers panel, and that will show us our mask. So as I was saying, we are creating a contrast adjustment, but we are not affecting any of the tones apart from the brighter tones in the mask. So with Lumi32, let's say we wanted to brighten up the darker tones without affecting the highlights. I can press Darks 1, and that, you see, selects almost all the tones in the image because we've got a dark image, but it's excluding the brighter tones. Now remember, if the tone up here on this slider is set to 0, that means it's targeting the shadows. If it's all the way to the right and set to 255, it's targeting the highlights. If it's in the middle, it's targeting the midtones. And the range tells us how limited we want our selection to be. So if I put the range all the way down to 35, you see we're still affecting the shadows, but we're selecting fewer of those shadows. And the range down to 11, we're selecting only the darkest parts of the image now. But if I bring that back up, let's say to 90, I can then look at the smoothness and amplification slider. Smoothness just determines how smooth we want our mask to be. So do we want it to be really contrasting, or do we want it to be softer in terms of contrast? And that affects the whole mask. If I bring it all the way to the right, that means it's not very smooth, so it's a very contrasting mask like this. And if I bring it all the way to the left, that will mean it's a much softer mask. Most of the time, we'll want our smoothness to be moved towards the right, so we can create a more contrasting mask which will target our selections better. But we often don't want to bring that slider all the way to the right because that might be too contrasting. You'll see how I use these sliders more throughout the course, so you'll get a more intuitive understanding for how they work. Now, amplification does a similar thing to smoothness, but it only affects the tones in the image. So for example, let's go back to bright swan. Now you'll see we're only selecting the highlights. Now if I bring up amplification, watch, it will brighten up the upper midtones and the highlights, but not affect the shadows. You see that? But if I bring smoothness to the left, you'll see it affects all the tones in the image. It softens everything, or it makes everything more contrasting. But amplification only affects the brighter areas in the mask. So let's go back to Darks 1. And I want to make more contrast between the darker and brighter tones, so I'm bringing the smoothness slider to the right here. Now I'm going to press curves again, and we've applied that mask to a curves layer. Now watch what happens if we bring up the curves adjustment. We're brightening only the darker tones. We're not affecting the highlights. What would happen if I disabled this mask? Well, I right click on the mask and press disable mask. Watch the street light here at the top. You see that growing brightness? Because we're now affecting the highlights. And if I make that mask visible again, it gets darker. The other great thing is once you've created a mask, in order to reuse that mask, you don't have to go into Lumi32 and adjust the sliders just as you did. We can hold down Control on a PC or Command on a Mac and left click on the mask. And you see we've made a selection. And let's say I want to open up a photo filter. We've now applied the mask to that photo filter. So I can go to, let's say, blue. And I can increase the density to blue, and we are giving the scene colder tones. And we're only affecting the darker tones. We're not affecting the highlights. So we're just making a cooler temperature within the darker tones. So that's how we can make very precise adjustments with luminosity masks in Lumi32. Another example of that is, let's say we're working with this image and we only want to select parts of the building. Let's say the edges of the building. Well, these are midtones, so we could probably make a good selection with the midtones, or we can use the interactive pick and click on that area. Now that looks like we're selecting color, but actually we're not. We're selecting the tone of the image. So there you see the building's really white, but if I create a curves layer and bring that slider up, we're affecting all of the image because this is a really open mask. It's not a contrasting mask. So if I go back to Lumi32 and do exactly what I just did there, we should still have that tone selected. Press OK. And now I bring down range. You see we're mainly selecting the building. We're also selecting some of the sky because that's partially grey. So I can bring the range down a little bit more. Remember, smoothness can increase contrast, so this will brighten up the brighter tones and darken the darker tones. So we're going to have more contrast there. And now if I press a curves layer, watch what happens. You see, before we were affecting the whole image, but now we're just affecting a very narrow part of the scene. And let's look at that mask. That's the mask that we've created. So with Lumi32, we can make really specific adjustments to tones. And with that in mind, let's move on to exposure blending. So to begin with exposure blending, usually we'll have multiple exposures. Here I've got 2 exposures, and they're open, as you can see, in separate windows. In order to put them into the same window, if you're a Raya Pro user, you just press stack, and that will stack your exposures. If you don't have Raya Pro, just select the move tool in the top left here. Left click on the image and keep your left mouse button down. Drag your image over to this tab in the top left here and hover it over the tab. Then bring the mouse down, hold shift and let go. And you see we've now layered these 2 files. And we can close that window. So let's talk about the positioning of these layers. Well, I often have my base exposure on the bottom. Now by base exposure, I mean my best exposure, the exposure that has most of the information in. And I think that this brighter exposure is the best exposure. So I put that at the bottom. I put my darker exposure on top. Now we want to create a mask that will blend those 2 exposures. But we have to consider what type of mask we want to create. You see, by having this darker exposure visible, that means that's what we see on the big screen here in Photoshop. So obviously I want to select the brights, I want to select the sky and put the sky from the darker exposure into this brighter exposure. So if I press brights 1, you see how the sky isn't white. It's partially selected, some parts of it are white and some parts are grey. So that means we don't have a complete selection of the sky. If I press apply, just watch what happens. You see we've got some of that sky now into the brighter exposure, but not much of it. So if I disable this mask, that's what the sky from the darker exposure looks like. It's got some lovely textures and lovely darker tones. But that mask hasn't brought those textures and dark tones through. And the reason why that didn't work was because we had this darker mask visible. You see, luminosity masks are built around whatever we see in front of us, so whatever this big image is. So if we build a mask around what we see, of course the sky isn't white because the sky isn't white in our darker exposure. But how do we get around that? Well, it's very simple. We can make this darker layer invisible by pressing the I button here, or we can hold down Alt and left click on this Add Layer Mask icon, and that creates a black mask. And that's the method I suggest you do more often. Now watch what happens when we create this Brights 1 mask. Remember, it builds the mask around whatever we see here on the big screen. And the sky on the big screen is white. So our mask should be white. And there we go. So this means the sky is completely selected in the mask. Now some of the buildings are also selected because you can see they're grey, light grey. So whatever's black in the mask is not selected. Whatever's grey is partially selected, and the brighter the grey, the more selected they are. So how do we make more contrast here? Well, we can bring down our range so that we're only selecting fewer tones, so we're just targeting the highlights. And of course, we can create more contrast by upping the smoothness slider. See, let's darken those foreground tones a bit more. Now we don't need to press amplification because the sky is already white. If the sky was more of a grey tone, then we could move that right and it would strengthen our selection, but we don't need to do that here. Now if we're happy with that mask, and I think that's fine, we can press apply. And you see we've brought through that beautiful sky from the darker exposure into the brighter exposure. Now we've reduced some of the highlights in the building rooftop here, but that's absolutely fine and in fact an improvement. Now remember, if you're blending exposures and you find the result is a little bit too strong, you can always reduce the opacity of the top exposure, of the darker exposure there, just to make it a bit more natural. And I think that's a bit better. So the rule is you want to build your mask around the exposure that offers the greatest selection. So in this circumstance, it was the brightest exposure. And that is often the case. So when I'm exposure blending, I will almost always have the darker exposure invisible when I'm creating my masks. And again, you'll see more examples of that as we go along in this tutorial. So here I just want to talk about the order in which we blend things. So in the cityscape I just showed you, we blended the darker exposure into the brighter exposure. But we can do it the other way around, you see. We can bring the brighter exposure to the top here, and in Lumi32 we can choose darks 1, because we only want to select the darkest tones in the image. If we're blending the brighter exposure into the darker exposure, the purpose of that is to brighten up those darker tones. So we will go for darks, and I'm pressing darks 1 here, and I'm going to bring the range down. We only want to select the darkest areas. And let's bring the smoothness up to create a little bit more contrast. Now you might find that this lady is going to come through in the final exposure blended example, but that's fine. And here we can press apply. Now you'll see we have quite a soft final result. I'm just going to make that image a bit bigger. That's because we've softened the contrast with that blend. So we can bring down the opacity of the brighter exposure. Let's say to around 42%. And you see how we are bringing back information, let's say in these areas in particular, which were previously dark and now they're brighter. And let's look at this area here. This is before and after. You see we're adding more information. Now with this lady here, the beauty of luminosity masks is we can select the mask and choose a brush, a black brush, because black will erase something from a mask, and we can just paint her out. And there we go. So that's a very quick example of how we can blend brighter exposures into darker exposures. So let's go back to our cityscape example. This time we're going to look at how we can apply masks. So previously we had this darker exposure invisible. We pressed brights 1, brought the range down a little bit, increased smoothness. And then when we were done, we pressed apply, and that applied the mask to our darker exposure. But another way to use luminosity masks is through brushing and active selection. So let's do that again. Just as before, I want to create a black mask on this layer, the darker layer. So I'm going to hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and left click on this button. Then I can make the darker exposure visible. And here we're going to create the same brights 1 mask. So I'll bring my range down, increase the smoothness to increase contrast, and I can choose select. And you see we have these marching ants around the image. To hide those, we press Ctrl and H or Command and H. We now select a brush and we choose a white brush, but we have to select our mask first. And then we choose a white brush, make the brush big, and always, where you can, use a soft brush. So my hardness is at 0 right now. Make sure your brush is set to normal blend mode and flow is at 100. And now I can paint on that mask. And you see we're not affecting the buildings. And because I'm painting the mask in, that means I'm not affecting the other parts of the image that I'm not touching. So for example, this building in the bottom right hand corner is now unaffected for the most part by the mask that I created. So if it is affected, I can choose a black foreground and a smaller brush and just paint it out. And the beauty of brushing in selections, as you'll see later on, is that we can make much more targeted adjustments. We're not making global changes to the entire image. In the next video, we're going to look at the most common mistakes we make when exposure blending. So hopefully you can avoid them in your images.